Hello everyone, welcome to Adventures Through the Mind. I am your host, as always, James W. Jesso. This is episode 84 and it features Jean Robertson, who is a member of my community here in Kitchener, Ontario, and someone I look up to as a very meaningful person in my life, although, as you'll hear in the interview, her and I don't really know each other very well, but I have been deeply influenced by the work that she has been putting out in the world and its impact on the community of people, the relationships that I live with every day. Jean Robertson is the founder and context holder of Upstart Collaboratory for Collaborative Culture Designing, which is a social laboratory that, to quote from their vision statement, is about putting the creativity and knowledge of the people of the community to work to design the institutions we don't presently have and can't yet imagine ourselves needing. This is one of those episodes that doesn't seem to have anything to do with psychedelics whatsoever, although obviously this podcast is very psychedelic, and even so, I'm not sure I could string together how it is that this relates to psychedelics even now, except to maybe say that the very act of thinking and communicating in the way that we do in this interview is a fairly psychedelic experience, as what is unknown about what we have brought forth to the conversation and what is yet unknown in the space between us as we meet to communicate manifests in time as we continue to stay present and bear witness actively to the emergence of those things in the conversation, which is a long and complicated, maybe convoluted way of saying that, well, this is kind of like a bit of a psychedelic trip just to have a conversation with Jean. And that is something to be said about the content here, because although what we talk about is something that I think you are going to enjoy, and it's something that I think will be very meaningful for you to hear, there's another layer to it, which is the way that we're having this conversation, which in and of itself is an expression of the very thing that she will be describing throughout the course of the interview. In regards to the interview, I want to give you a heads up on a few tech-related specifications. This is my first on-location interview. If you're watching it on YouTube, it's only going to be one unchanging frame, which is a mistake that I learned to not do again, although I had recorded several interviews before I learned that. But it's just one continuous take, and I had to patch together 3 different audio signals to bring this podcast together, and it turned out pretty well, although there were a few moments where the consistency of the audio shifts in order to ensure that you can hear what's being said. And on top of that, the nature of the conversation is that it's slow at first anyways, and there's the real, concerted effort to offer spaciousness. And instead of manipulating the flow of the conversation so that it aligned with that fast boom, 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 boom narrative that is so present in the type of podcasting content and YouTube content that we're used to, I just decided to leave it as it was. So there are some times where there is some, we'll say, pregnant silence in this conversation, which is very different than the way that I normally, edit, or the way that the conversations here on Adventures Through the Mind typically go. So I do hope that you find a real sense of being with that spaciousness as it arises. Of course, before we get into the interview, just going to give a big shout out to my patrons on Patreon, especially the people whose names are listed in the upper corner of this video on YouTube or written in the description to this episode on YouTube or on whatever podcatcher you like to listen to this podcast with. If you would like to become a patron of the show, I would really appreciate that, and you can do so by heading to patreon.com/James W. Jesso. There are other ways that you could support the show, which include buying blotter art or buying copies of my book or just straight up leaving me a PayPal or crypto donation. Information about all of that can be found at jameswjesso.com/support, and all the links to everything that I have just mentioned here insofar as support can be found in the description to this episode. So thank you very much and enjoy this interview with Jean Robertson here on Adventures Through the Mind.
Hello, Jean, how are you?
I'm good.
Well, now that the cameras are rolling, all of a sudden I feel slightly postured. How are you feeling?
Well, I'm carrying the questions that I've been mulling over this morning about what it is that we both want out of this conversation. So
That's actually something that obviously I have to consider for every interview.
Right.
But I have been considering for this one as well, because I understand there's like a real wealth of knowledge here. And I'm not really sure what angle of approach seemed to make the most sense to optimize our time together the most.
right. I don't have any answers to that either, but at least we're both putting it in the middle. So
Yeah, putting it in the middle.
Yeah.
So
which is a phrase that we often use, that that we're concerned with the middle of any conversation or any working relationship, which is the kind of collaborative co-generation of meaning or whatever it is that we're doing.
well, that seems like a pretty good place to start then, because collaborative, this word, this concept, is a fairly strong pillar of what you're doing here. Can you maybe give us an understanding of what you mean by collaborative, and how that fits into what I've often heard referred to as the collaborative mindset in reference to the coercive mindset?
Right. Yes, I can. And the reason I hesitate is because it also brings up maybe needing to back up one, what we call level of abstraction, to kind of considering what you're kind of pointing at when you ask, what do we mean by collaborative? That part of what we're dealing with is the slipperiness and creative nature of language. And one of the things that I've been saying recently as a kind of pointer is my sense that what we're dealing with is an epistemological crisis that the whole society is in, which is embedded in our language and meaning, and shows up, for instance, in using the word collaborative or using any word to describe what we're doing. How is it already understood, and what are we trying to point at? And that shows up in every conversation all the time. So that's not just an abstract concern. And where it shows up creatively is a lot of play with language.
And you're meaning this in particular to the context here of the learning community, or I know you have several learners, but in general.
I mean it here, and I mean it in the wider sense of what we're going to kind of try to talk about as the collaborative mindset. That it, in my experience, is a playful one, and it plays with language very deeply, and it has to, because we're kind of trapped by the meanings that we've already made and shared culturally. So
maybe I want to put a pin in this whole idea of the collaborative mindset, because you just said something there that I think is really interesting. Cool. And also something that I think would be really relevant to the conversation moving forward, which is a discussion about meaning being contained in the words that we use, and utilizing a shift in language and a creativity around how we relate to language personally and interpersonally can shift the meaning. Can you maybe unpack a little bit about that?
Well, maybe in order to do that, I'll go back to what you asked me now.
Sure.
We've got that. Okay. We've got that out in the middle. Yeah. So the way that I'm using the word collaborative is in comparison to the word coercive. That's one of the ways of pairing those, which is not an either-or dualistic pairing, as people say. And another way of expressing that we're using is what we call humanity 2 and humanity 3. which assumes there's a humanity one, which is sort of an unfolding progression. So we're tracking the sense that not just us, but and many different sources are looking at our history and anthropological knowledge and future in new ways in the last 150 years. And in addition, we've also got a whole lot of new knowledge in the last 30 or 40 years about our neurology, our brain, the way that we seem to be constituted in that unfolding history. Mm-hmm. So a lot of sources are pointing to and talking about the last 10,000 years of human history as some kind of unit, in a way like a unit of meaning. Okay. And that there is some profound change underway that is a transition to something different. Which also suggests that pre that 10,000 years, there was something else that changed. And that to me has been an incredibly exciting shift in my lifetime. Like, I remember being in high school in the 50s when the first kind of world history courses were being taught. It was just the beginning of expanding from British colonial fur trade history as what you were supposed to be, to this completely different landscape. And like seeing the culture starting to talk in terms of 10,000 years being a comprehensible piece of understanding relevant to understanding who we are today. So it's kind of in the middle of that cultural shift about our knowledge that this sense has been evolving in different ways about this shift. And I'm using that humanity 2 for the last 10,000 years and humanity 3 for what seems to be emerging as a human potential. And there's many ways of describing that last 10,000 years. One that's emerged also in that lifetime is talking about it as patriarchy. Mm-hmm. Okay. Or hierarchical top-down culture, which we're able to talk about now because we have some inkling of we could organize ourselves differently. And that's even showing up in business.
Well, there's so much in what you're saying there when I'm thinking about these 3 humanities. Mm-hmm. Thinking like 1.0 would be prior to the agricultural revolution. Yeah, basically. Which would require a system of hierarchical control to maintain the surplus, which would then create social classes that would, well, no, I don't want to participate in the fallacy and the stereotype of the divine savage here, or whatever it's called, the noble savage, but out of our nomadic roots into this very stable, sort of contained, and then eventually getting into where we are now, which is almost nomadic again, but also nomadic and stable and interconnected and infused with communication technology.
Right. And new knowledge about what it means to be a human being, apparently. Mm-hmm. Which means all of those cultures which have existed as membranes because they were able to either isolate themselves or eat up competing cultures are now interfacing and having to deal with the differences in their fundamental assumptions, as well as we're becoming aware of some similarities in a level below that, which I'm calling the platform on which cultures are built. So that the coercive, what I'm pointing to as the coercive, is a platform of thinking that emerged with the settling down. So you get different cultures, but they have that similarity created by the circumstances that you're talking about.
Yeah, okay. And the thing in the middle is turning out to be quite an interesting puzzle. Couple words there that I feel would be good to unpack as we slowly get to a greater understanding of collaborative and the collaborative mindset is patriarchy. Because I know that a lot of my listeners are males. And I also know that a lot of males generally tend to feel really uncomfortable with the idea of the patriarchy because in popular culture, which certainly isn't thoughtful culture, but in popular culture, patriarchy is often sort of spit out as a means to express rage at an institution holding individuals accountable. And we're all responsible, of course, but there's a lot of the use of patriarchy as a term that creates some sort of intellectual justification for the hatred of men in general.
Right.
So I'm just curious if you can describe what you mean as with patriarchy, and then how that sort of ties into a greater description of the coercive mindset.
I'm going to slightly evade that in order to answer it. So I'm trying to answer it, but I think starting from someplace else, which is this question of what does the collaborative as we're holding it look like, as we're kind of understanding it. And the we being not just the work that we're doing here, but as you may have noticed, we're surrounded by a few thousand books in this house, which are the instantiations of many people trying to deal with all of these questions in different ways. I think the thing that undercuts what you're pointing at as problem with the word patriarchy is this uncovering of the human. I'm going to use the humanity 3. We'll come back to the collaborative because I believe we don't have much experience of what collaborative is pointing at in humanity 3, and then we confuse it with unsuccessful examples of collaboration that we've participated in. So the humanity 3, the deep pointers are that it requires a post-judgmental framework of understanding and usage, which doesn't, and when I'm saying judgment, that's a kind of basket to include all of blame, shame, praise, evaluative comparisons of worth on the good, bad, better, worse scale, and which means that it has a different sense of what ethical, moral understandings look like. And part of the problem of meaning here is that on the H2, the Humanity 2 platform, it's generally dualistic and judgmental, because those were the power structures that enforced the hierarchical control. And from that perspective, it seems like if you're not using right-wrong judgment, you have no ethics. Whereas from a Humanity 3 perspective, what has happened is that the idea of morals has moved up a level of abstraction. And it helps to use the word power, for instance, as an example of that. And I think it's in one of Adam Kahane's books, Power and Love, where he talks about, in the 1990s, the kind of received authority, highest kind of academic authority on power, finally said, wait a minute, there's more than one kind of power. We have been using power in a way that's pointing at coercive, dominating, controlling power. But there's actually other ways that power is exerted. Influence, for instance, or collaboration to generate new possibilities. But once you've got two distinct kinds of power, you need a new level of abstraction of the word power that includes both of those. Okay. And that has been emerging in different people's writings and reflections on that. So power starts to mean the ability to influence or change or move people's behavior. And it might be coercive power or it might be collaborative power. If you use collaborative to cover the whole basket of ways that you might influence, move people, rather than direct force, controlling, or threat of force.
And that would be the coercive model,
Yes.
this like threat of force in some way.
Yes.
And that would be associated to what you mean by a patriarchal
Yes.
society,
Yes.
which generally, just because it's a patriarchy, it puts the father on the top. And if you go back, the father was always our Lord in heaven. It wasn't necessarily, It was God, and then it was the priest, and then it was eventually...
And the authority is seen to be derived from the top down.
Yes, and from a coercive good and bad modeling that, punishes for what is deemed moralistically wrong and praises.
Right.
And praise and blame are both things that you mentioned are removed from the collaborative mindset.
Praise is Carol Dweck's mindset has been a very influential book in this. And the particular expression of mindset that she explored that's kind of become standard in the field of education and sociology and talking about this is what she calls growth mindset rather than fixed mindset. Now, I would describe those are two of the characteristics of the overall mindset. But the discovery that the fixed mindset is related to reflections for young learners or holding ideas that talent is a fixed thing that's an attribute of you. So that praise that says, oh, you're a good artist or a good drawer or a good thinker has an entirely different effect on young learners than a reflection that emphasizes you worked really hard at that. You learned something there. You kept at that, and now you're able to do this thing that you weren't before. So there's a dynamic growth appetite that's built. And with the other, what happens is people become unwilling to try because they've now got an investment in being good. And it appears it's like that's threatened by being shown to be not valid. Which is part of the whole overall mindset where your identity is tied up with titles or labels that are given to you. And your value to society has been in which identities you can claim, and not who you are as an individual in those identities.
Well, that definitely points to a lot of a lot of very relevant themes in my own work and research around how a lacking capacity for the offering of unconditional love in parenthood, or as parents to children in childhood, along with the appropriate guidance to ensure, a child grows up not to, run themselves into flames or cut themselves with knives or eat too many cookies, whatever. But to have a lack of that unconditional love, which makes the primary agent, the primary nutrient in our development, and possibly in all of life, which is love, which is safety, security, inclusion in the group. As an infant, it's everything from, security and being fed to not dying alone. Love is essential for the infant's survival. And if love is conditional, then you cannot actually be who you are. You have to be what needs to be done in order to gain love. And then later in life, you won't, unless you do the hard work to change things, you won't necessarily be able to offer the love to others or to your children or receive it, because you're blocked from being able to give and receive that love by the defensive patterns that protect you from the pain of not having that love, that show up as your personality or as who you believe yourself to be, but you're actually, and this is all sort of associated in with this coercive cycle, which is there's a good way to be and there's a bad way to be, and there's a series of tactics that we all learn to conform each other's behaviors towards good through the praising of good and the shaming, the guilting of bad. And so what does it look like inside of the collaborative model? Because you said it's not a, like collaborative versus coercive, like which one will win? The collaborative includes the coercive model. Can you maybe, I know that we kind of got off talking about the meaning contained in words, but we're sort of sorting it out in live action here. But can you talk about how the collaborative model fits in, or how the coercive model fits into the collaborative model?
Right. And what I'd point at is there's two ways of talking about it that are essential in terms of what we're exploring. One is the conceptual understanding of that, and the other is what's the experiential living nature of shifting that kind of understanding. Because just a conceptual understanding of it doesn't do it. And yet it is necessary, because otherwise just trying to change something ends up feeling like you're changing it because you should, which is part of the old thing, which gets you in the binds like you should relax.
Right. Don't shit on me. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it's really important holding together both the conceptual understanding and the experiential, practical living differently and dealing with yourself and others and the thought patterns differently in new ways, moment by moment. And we actually have a word for that practice, which I think is, if there's anything really novel about us, it's the creation of this word abstragmatics.
Okay.
Where you're integrating the abstract or the big picture that you're developing as an individual philosopher, if you like, with your day-to-day behavior, which means carrying a sense of all the things that we're talking about as live when you're doing the dishes. And we keep coming back to the dishes because it's such a juicy example of where all of these, we're inclined to say that the last 10,000 years of history is at the kitchen sink. If we can do it differently there, we can do it differently anywhere.
Sure, anyone that's ever lived with another person completely relates to what you're saying right now.
Exactly.
So then let's stay on the abstraction level. When I think about, what it really feels like to be in the collaborative whatever, it feels something like exactly what I'm feeling without any judgments on those feelings. They simply are how they are, and they're held inside of a larger container of awareness, which is either my own or it's being held by somebody else in some sort of relational dynamics in a certain context, where everything that I might possibly be at any given moment is held inside of the awareness based in safety. This relationship is safe, and love. Not necessarily unconditional love, that's a childish need. And if we seek childish needs, we stay emotionally children. But more like compassion, empathy plus care, which cares and loves and sees and holds the child needs and the adult needs, because it still acknowledges that you're still an adult. So that's what it kind of like, that's what it feels like, or at least that's the concept. And it often feels really painful. It often feels really painful. At least the times where I'm most noticing it are the times when it hurts. When it's easy, I don't notice. It just passes through me. It's just like a breeze on a spring day. I don't know if you want to speak on that.
Yeah. I think where I'd start on that is my sense about the what you're pointing at is the unconditional love or acceptance. That word love is, again, very slippery because it has so many meanings. Also, I think it's Winnicott's voicing of this that I'm going back to, but in that era, the understanding of it as both safety and challenge, but like a mediated challenge, so that it's not overwhelming, because the nature of the world is challenge all the time. So it's like a safe container in which to learn to deal with the challenges.
Yeah, safe, definitely safe doesn't mean everything's padded.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that is important. Mm-hmm. And we've got attached even to that word unconditional love, a sense, again, that we should be doing it. And as well, that it's a kind of, it's asking us to be saintly. Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of ambivalence that we've built up culturally about this unconditional love thing that sort of says, yes, but we're only human. So we can try, but I actually think it is a doable, learnable thing, and that's important, that the understanding within H3 that we're looking at learnable things, not ideals which challenge us but are unreachable. And that's really important for people being willing to undertake the kinds of changes that are necessary, because we build up these images of impossible demands. So coming back to what I'm wanting to tie it into is Mark Epstein's recent book. I think it's called Advice Not Given, and it has a great chapter which includes him citing, again, I think it's Winnicott, listing what he calls 18 reasons mothers hate their babies, which was groundbreaking because it was admitting that mothers hate but I'm changing that to, I think what mothers hate is the experience they're having with their babies. And that makes all the difference when you understand that, understandably, there's demands that are put on parents, mothers, and fathers that put them in situations where anybody would hate the experience that they're having.
Yeah.
But being able to distinguish that from hating your baby is absolutely essential, because otherwise you end up hating yourself for hating the baby.
Which just makes you progressively a worse parent.
Exactly, exactly. And it's those kinds of differentiations which are conceptual and language, but also have really, really important impacts on the experience possible. It's kind of exploring and integrating all of those and actually aiming within the work that we're doing to live this Humanity 3 experience to the utmost level of our current understanding of it, and saying that is a real possibility.
I said this to you a few days ago when you were at my house. I had made a comment that although I don't know you very well, that I feel like I am really benefiting from the experiences personally and interpersonally that are emerging in me and through me as a result of this philosophy that you've been building over the course of your lifetime being lived by the people in my community, by the people in my friends group, and me being included in that and invited to learn. And one of the things that has been coming up, a part of this collaborative mindset, is this idea that nothing is wrong. No one's to blame. And that even in the midst of a conflict with another person, the fear that, I'm going to be judged, I'm going to be blamed, I'm going to lose this friendship, I'm going to be a bad guy. And I'm talking about my own wounds projected in the narratives by which I relate to my own fears. But that starts, I have a capacity to understand that those things aren't real in the relationship, because I already know, prior to being triggered into a heightened state of fear, that the person I'm interacting with cares. And I care about maintaining the integrity of the relationship over time, and that we are together willing to look at these aspects that are challenging without blaming or judging each other for them, but being with them, learning through them, and building a stronger relationship in the process. And it's something about that foundation. It really allows a lot of those fears not to go away, but all of a sudden they become ever so slightly, but certainly very significantly manageable.
Right. Well, and a part of that is gradually building a model where you understand how they got constructed. And that's the role of understanding, and why I've redefined in our usage thinking as a blend of understanding and choosing. And our choosing is our valuing. What you choose is what you value at that point. And our relating, like how do we hold the relation with ourselves and each other, which is the kind of framework that you're pointing at, that the relationship doesn't have to be at stake in making this into action. And that thinking is that whole cycle, rather than there's thinking and feeling. That it's a blend, a dynamic blend that's going on, that you can kind of take apart in that way, distinguish those things, because that gives you leverage for changing your own thinking. It doesn't mean that those are absolute realities, but it's a way of describing a dynamic process that gives you leverage to work with it dynamically.
Not entirely tangential or like non sequitur, but from there, going back to this discussion about how the coercive model fits inside of the collaborative model, which is that even going to the place where I'm judgmental of myself, of others, that I say, act, behave that in ways that are in alignment with the coercive cycle in myself, in the group, that I haven't actually at any point stepped outside of the collaborative model in a way. That I'm still a part of it, I'm just not actively experiencing myself or acting from that place explicitly. Like it's a how would you describe it?
Well, I think it brings in the use of the concept of meta, and that is something that's in the culture now, like the meta communication. This idea that, and again, that is reflecting different levels of abstraction. That there is a part of you that can hold, even though you feel immersed in that judgment at that moment. It's like your model of yourself is such that you're not identifying everything with what you're experiencing at just that moment. So there's room to hold and look at and reflect on your experience within that kind of meta. So people here often have come to say, I'm feeling really irritated right now, but I'm meta okay. Like, I know that this exactly what you're saying. I know this is the momentary experience, and that our relationship is meta okay.
Right, like I don't particularly like you right now, but our relationship is still solid.
Yeah, and I know that my not liking you isn't even personal to you. I'm just going through a loop right now.
Right, interesting. That brings up two things: the whole not taking it personally, but this idea of not being able to like a person and still in the moment, or say not like the experience you're having with a person.
Yes.
But still deeply care for that person and to nourish the relationship.
Which comes back to the image of the mother
Exactly.
doing that with the infant while having experiences that can lead her to feel incredibly irritated and to seek support from other people so that it doesn't end up getting internalized toward herself or enacted with the child.
Which, in the way that I look at it, is the point wherein unconditional love, which is the nutrient that enables the parent to go through the suffering
Right.
and sacrifice of parenthood,
Right.
but is the essential nutrient around which a child organizes its very sense of self.
Right.
The nutrient or lack of.
Right.
That just happens to, like, I know that you suggested that unconditional love is a learned skill, and I'm not sure where I am to like fully take that on board, but I definitely believe that iterations of unconditional love that is necessary in children that are ultimately very similar can manifest in adulthood without the sense of like a child should never be expected like to conform to what the parent's needs are, where an adult can be expected to some degree to conform to those needs, which to me would then no longer point to unconditional love, because I believe there needs to be some sort of conditions in order for that relationship to be maintained. For example, I can know that there's love here, but there's a particular name that you call me that makes me feel really uncomfortable, and I'd like it if you don't call me that name. That's a condition for us to continue working towards this relationship, and yet you keep calling me this name. That's a condition that, if isn't met, well, then this relationship can't continue, because otherwise I'd be setting myself up to be harmed by you repeatedly over an otherwise significant but menial request to not use a certain name.
Well, and I think there's more choices than that even. I mean, it's all exploring new territory. One of the relationships with part of our community that you know of is someone that I've been in relationship, friendship, collegial relationship with over 20 years. And when I moved down here from Calgary, I was expecting that we would take up that collegial relationship in a more concrete, dynamic way. And it turned out that that was not possible. Where I found myself eventually as I kind of took this in was able to say to her, I can't work with you. I won't work directly with you. And I am committed to your leadership in this work and supporting it in whatever way makes deep sense to me. And that may not be comfortable to you, but I want you to know that I am committed to that, and I will stay committed to that. And it took several years for that to come around to the place where we are comfortably same-sided now. So, I think what I'm trying to address is what you're saying is, how is it possible to stay in that relationship and take care of yourself? That there may be more choices, more ways as we get more experience with the cultural platform, even of powerful ways. And I think, while you were talking, also there was an awareness forming in me. That's what's so neat is talking about it, is it actually furthers the kind of thinking, is that that what you're pointing at with unconditional love, I've also said unconditional acceptance, maybe it makes more sense to understand that as not even a personal thing, but part of the cultural commons of the social structure, that each parent-child relationship can call on, needs to call on. And it has not been available as a cultural commons. That's part of the transition that we're going through, is this new model or understanding of what it means to be a human being and what's needed to nurture and nourish that. And that rather than that's supposed to be a kind of innate thing that you as an individual bring in, if you fail on that, it's your failure as an individual, that it's rather a failure of the culture's model. Ted Hargrave wrote a post in which he said, your culture has failed you and now you are failing your culture, as a way of understanding. And he didn't mean it judgmentally, but as a way of understanding where we find ourselves.
Wait, Tad Hargrave, the guy who's like marketing for hippies or whatever?
Yeah.
He studies with Stephen Jenkinson,
Yes.
and Stephen Jenkinson is a big contributor to that discussion around us failing our culture.
Yes.
As an extension of the culture.
Yes, I figured that was where it kind of, I knew there was that background loop, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, Tad is also good friends with Ian McLeod, who's done some of the videoing of Stephen Jenkins.
Ian McKenzie.
Yeah.
Yes, cool. Yeah, I'd like to have him on the show one day. And
Yeah.
I've had Stephen on the show, actually. Anyways, we're digressing.
Yes. Well, we are, and I just want to point out that is part of sort of drawing on the many sources of thinking that are converging on how do we create the institutions and the human possibility that seems like the only thing that's going to give us a basis of thinking together that can begin to address the multiple crises that our previous way of thinking has created.
Yeah, has brought to our doorstep.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. Thinking about the time and also considering what would be an interesting topic to end on or to close the conversation.
Yeah.
And I'm feeling into meaning. I like to talk about love and unconditional love, and thinking about it, maybe my better description of what I was talking about with unconditional love in childhood is parental love. I personally believe the sense of self and our perception of reality is a process by which we organize ourselves around the feeling state, primarily of our mother, but also the feeling states of each of the primary caregivers and the implied emotional dynamics, the implied meaning of reality held by the emotional and cognitive dynamics of the larger developmental nest or the parental ecology. And that parental love, just like, say, compassion, or just like this cultural commons you were talking about, is a connection with a greater capacity within us that isn't necessarily the manner in which it manifests. But in childhood, parental love is the feeling state around which we not only organize our authentic self, which is a non-defensive, non-strategic expression of who we are, but also our capacity to connect with love and loving in general, including loving ourselves and being able to care for ourselves and to love others and to offer love to our children. And so, yeah, I like this idea of like the cultural commons. And I digressed from what I was trying to get to, which is...
It's hard not to.
Right, because there's the thing, it's so interesting, this bit here in the middle. What about meaning? Because we sort of started off with that, and although we've really talked around the meaning of of the collaborative mindset and the coercive mindset, this is a really broad question, so come at it any angle that you like. But what do you mean by meaning? And how is it associated with our mindset?
Yeah. It's a great question. And what that brings up for me is the role of questions. And like questioning what meaning means is a meta questioning that's new. And for it not only to be, it's not the occasional esoteric philosopher who's questioning, it's like the whole culture is permeated. The whole idea, what is meaning? What is true? We're inundated with this idea of fake news. This comes back to the sense that we're in an epistemological crisis about how do we know what we know, what is meaningful to us, and how do we organize our collective and our individual meanings in ways that can allow us a human future.
And so that's the question.
Right, and the role of, so one article that I have a photocopy of that was really relevant to my thinking was a late essay by Margaret Mead in which who of course was married to Gregory Bateson, and Gregory Bateson is another great influence on my thinking. And after a lifetime of anthropological and sociological activity, she said that the huge shift that she saw us living through was that up until the Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, the whole of human society generally was organized with around the three living generations: parents, grandparents, and children. And everything that it meant to be human had to be passed on for millions of years. However you calculate when we became human, as in the living oral experience of those three generations. And it was intensely conservative. It had to be, because you had to get everything in those interactions, in the rituals and everything. Every moment was impregnated with the meaning that had to be passed on. Then information took on a new role, so that the immigrant population coming to North America could expect to get a different life for their children by exposing them to new possibilities of information. And in doing that, it created a gulf between the generations. And then we've had like 200 years of information-based. If you could get the new information, you could have a new life. But we've come to the point at which that information has now created situations that we don't know how to handle. And so the relevant piece from here on is, what questions can we surface and follow? And that the role of the elders is now to support the questioning of the new generations, to ask new questions and hold new questions, then form their lives. So the emphasis now has gone from the past, the present, and into how do we hold the future, and how do we nurture the new generations to be able to deal with the questions of the future to which we don't have answers.
Right, because the future could look radically different. 200 years ago, or maybe we'll say 500 years ago, the difference between 3 to 4 generations would not be as massive.
No.
And you've seen in your own lifetime, right? Like, you saw the first course on world history in your lifetime. And the idea that we live in a global society is commonplace to elementary school kids. Like, that's just, it's not even something that you necessarily learn in school. It's a known thing already, and then it's developed in school. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about this phrase. I'm not sure if anyone else has said it, but give credit to whoever said it if it wasn't me. This idea that we used to have very little information, but we were steeped in really profound meaning. And now we're drowning in information. We're starved of meaning in our lives.
And we're creatures who make patterns of meaning biologically, as everything living does. That's how you survive, is through the interactions of your patterns of meaning with your means of survival. So we continue to make those patterns, but are they serving us for a real future? So it's like having to consciously take responsibility, and I spell that response-ability, as I find other people do, which is a post-judgmental. No, we are responsible we're able to respond, and we are accountable for our impacts. In that we need the feedback on our impacts in order to act responsibly, to continue to act responsibly, and create the meaning and potential.
This actually points to something that's very present in Jungian psychoanalysis, this idea that at some point earlier we had very strong culture and very strong mythology that gave us our meaning, and it was contained inside of our tribe. Like, we really connected with that. It was almost impermeable. And then it completely dismantled at some point. And now we are without any relevant mythology or out with any relevant strong culture, except for maybe the cult of materialism. But like, we're without that, and the role now, and I think this is James Hollis says this as well, he's a Jungian thinker that I really appreciate, is that the role of giving meaning onto your life has shifted from the culture to the individual, which is both incredibly daunting and incredibly freeing, because we get to choose. And like you said, now we're in this situation like, yeah, we totally just get to choose. But what choices are we going to make? And what questions are we going to ask ourselves by which we orient the meaning-making process?
And I think that that ties everything together, to come back to what the collaborative is pointing at, is that we are not separate individuals, we're interdependent. So that meaning-making has to be a collaborative meaning-making, not just an individual one. And we have to re-understand and relearn our interactions as parts of systems, participants in systems. And that's where systems thinking becomes a basic part of the new curriculum of human understanding.
Yeah, cool. And it also makes a clear differentiation between individuating and individuality, where one says, I'm my own person over here, and the other one says, I am claiming responsibility for who I am, and then chooses to be a part of a tribe, a culture of thinking that aligns with that journey of individuation, which takes responsibility for who I am and takes responsibility for the stories that I tell myself. And
for us, and who we want to become.
Right, and who we will end up, like, we're passing along from here, like from here, but also, like, you know, well, I'm a man, so maybe from here, but like,
Yep.
Thank you, Jean. I really appreciated this conversation today.
That's great.
Is there anywhere that the listeners of the podcast can learn more about your work?
That is a difficult question at the moment. There is upstartcollaboratory.org is a point. It doesn't have a lot there, but it has a connection point.
Cool. Well, I will check in with you again when this interview is going to go up, because it's going to be a little while. Okay. Thank you for opening yourself up to this conversation, as well as opening yourself up to be an experimental first live video conversation.
Wonderful. Okay.
And cut.
Okay, thank you very much for listening to this episode of Adventures Through the Mind. It was my first on-location interview, and it was an interesting one. I hope that you enjoyed it, and perhaps we will hear more from Jean in the future. If you like this episode, please tell a friend and share it amongst social media. That is an excellent way to support the show. Alternatively, or additionally, you can do some type of financial support to the show, which would include Patreon, PayPal, Bitcoin, or buying something from the shop, such as one of my books on psilocybin mushrooms or a limited edition Adventures Through the Mind blotter art. Links to all of that are contained in the description to this episode on YouTube or at jameswjesso.com. Thank you very much, and I will see you on the next episode of Adventures Through the Mind. James Jesso signing out from Canada, where cannabis has been recently legalized.